Hello, everybody. This is Chris Wilmuth and Sean King, and this is the Pulling Around Show.
Hi
What's
guys, today we've got Austin Hill. Austin is one of the youngest, if not the youngest, cue maker in America right now. He's also a good player. And what else can we say about you, Austin?
Uh, there's a lot of things you can say.
We could say
Uh,
blogger. We could
uh,
say
yeah. I like to introduce myself as a traveling pool enthusiast and a billiard product connoisseur, and that
okay.
kind of describes my life in a nutshell, anyway.
You definitely need to go to his Facebook page. He just wrote one of the greatest posts ever for cue collectors. Man, what was this last week like for you?
Yeah, so this weekend, a lot of people don't even know, but the ICCS, the International Cue Collectors Show, was held here in Oklahoma City, at a high-end hotel. And we're here outside of Chester's Billiards, where they also had a tournament and some other events that were related. But this is my first year being introduced to the ICCS show, and it's really a pretty big honor. It's invitation only, and it's for a lot of the cue makers and cue collectors from all over the world. Um, I've heard stories about it since I was a kid. Sean mentioned me as one of the youngest cue makers ever. I don't know if that's true, but I started building cues and doing cue repair and things when I was 15, 16. So I think you'd be hard pressed to find many younger cue makers than me, besides Craig Peterson, which a lot of people don't know him, but he used to work for Brunswick and all types of other cue makers. But it's really an honor to even be invited, and glad I got to participate. And it was a learning experience for me. And like Sean said on my last Facebook post, you can go check out my little nutcap of that. That'll explain it. So yeah.
Okay, now I can't forget to mention that they held a tournament for ICCS members only. They shut the doors at Chester's, and he snapped that tournament off. Now, it was only a race to 2-9 ball, but he got there. He beat them all.
Yeah, I won, and it was cue collectors and cue makers only. You had to be a member of the show to participate. It was more of a social thing. There was no cash payouts or prizes. Um, there was some trophies that were donated by John Barton, the owner of Chester's, who pool hall we're outside of now, which was really cool. They were kind of gaff trophies because it was more of a fun thing. And Sean saying it was only a race to 2-9 ball. That does mean something, but that's one of the hardest formats to win. One of the luckiest and hardest. Fortunately, it was really fun for me because I was able to win, and I also was able to play some of the cue makers that I've been fans of, and they're kind of celebrities to me since I was 15 and 16. When I first started reading about cues on the internet, watching videos on YouTube, seeing guys cues in person. Some of these people, I've seen their cues for years, and I've admired them and looked up to them, and it's one of the first times I ever got to actually meet them. So it's kind of like meeting the president for me,
Yeah.
or somebody of major importance. So it was fun. And I did there was a case maker by the name of Ronald Arnold from Arkansas, very generous, and he donated a custom-made, built-to-order case for the winner, which is his cases are extremely elegant and fancy, and they're worth quite a bit. So that was a good prize that I'm fortunate to be able to claim.
So he gets that case for winning the tournament.
Yeah,
That's probably worth a few $1,000s easy.
yeah. So he had one that was his last one that he showed. It was a $3,500 case. That's the thing that was interesting about the Q show being open to the public for a short period of time. I make my living doing cues, buying and selling cues, cases, doing cue repairs. I subsidize my income with a little bit of pool playing in between to get by. But a lot of people have no clue how expensive some of these cues and cases are, and how many millions of dollars worth of cues are bought and sold each year all over the world. That was one of the topics in our collector meeting, that there was over $4 million in cues at the show, and there was over 350,000 in completed sales there. And there's plenty of money on the table for everybody, and cue making is a real career. A lot of people don't think it is. It gets a bad name associated with pool players, but it's how you treat it and how you do it. So
Okay. No, let's let you name some of the cue makers that were there, and then we can talk about the collectors. So they have on the outside of the room when you walk in, The outside is all the cue makers, and the inside booths are the cue collectors. How about the cue makers?
Yeah, so not all the cue makers were there. They're not all able to come every year, but there was about 15 exhibiting cue makers there this year, and some guys are extremely well known and legends. Some guys are, middle of the road, and some guys it was their first time there. And there was also a lot of cue makers like myself that weren't exhibiting. They were just there to attend. That were being a part of the voting, part of the whole ceremony. That didn't actually have any cues to present. So there was many of those too. But there was Shelby Williams, Eddie Cohen, Richard Black, Doug Beasley from North Carolina, Mike Bender from Alaska. There was all sorts of collectors from Japan. There was Marcus Dentis of Arthur Q from Germany. The list goes on, but it was amazing to see there's people from all over the world.
Jerry
all
McWhorter.
different. Yeah, Jerry McWhorter. Yep, he was Jerry is from California, and he's been a cue maker for 30 years. And he actually helped organize the ICCS in the early days. And without him, it wouldn't exist. But he's also one of the top cue makers in the world, and just an all-around extremely talented and intelligent guy. And he's one of the best pool-playing cue makers there is. And I've known that for years. And it just turns out I was really friendly with him this weekend, and I happened to beat him in the finals of the tournament. So it was a big win for me for multiple reasons because of that. But yeah, everybody was there just about.
Well, I want to give a shout out to Jerry McWhorter because he probably spent the most time with me over the weekend besides Austin. We got to go out to breakfast and play a little one pocket, and really interesting guy.
Yeah, he's extremely nice.
All right, Chris.
So when did you
That's
first
enough
start?
for an intro.
I already did an intro. So
I said that's enough for the intro.
okay, all right. So what's the first cue when did you first start making cues?
Okay, so I guess I'll give you a little bit of history of my background, how I got into cues and what I did from a young age. Right now I'm 24, which I'm going bald a little bit, kind of like Sean here. So a lot of people think I'm a little older than that. And I've been around this industry and the pool world and the cue market for, 10 years or so, since I was a teenager. I first started playing pool with my dad. He used to play pool, and he used to buy people in Calcuttas and go to tournaments and stuff. And when I was young, he started bringing me around. So I've been playing pool since I was maybe 13, 14. And of course, like any young kid, I got pretty good kind of fast to a certain point, When I really first got into cues, I was about 14, 15. And then when I first got into doing cue making and cue repairs was 15, 16. The first cue I ever owned was just a player's cue. It was purple.
Okay.
It was a $100 player's cue. And, from there, I had all sorts of production cues, which production cues get a bad name, but they're really great cues. They're just made in bigger numbers. They're not as customized. Some of them don't have quite the attention to details the custom cues, but some production cues are also a lot better cues than other custom cues. But I had Mucci's, and I should say I'm originally from Wisconsin, which is a huge cue making capital of the world. You have McDermott cues in Milwaukee, Schoen cues in Milwaukee. You had Nova cues, Schuler cues, Jacoby, Peachauer, Schmelke, and a dozen custom guys or more that you could list off.
Wow.
And so when in my younger days, I had a lot of those. But I would say McDermott's and Schoen's were probably the two most popular cues that I had at a young age. I'm young and from the age of the internet. So when I first got online and got on Facebook, started seeing pool groups, cues for sale, one way or another, I got into kind of buying, selling, and trading cues. And, I wanted to own everything and try them all. So I went from a Schoen to higher end production cues. And then I think Jacoby was probably one of the first custom production cues I owned. And the first custom cue that I ever owned was a Eric Crisp, made by a guy named Eric Crisp. His cues are called Sugar Tree cues. And they're very simple cues with very high-end exotic woods and a lot of attention to detail. And a lot of people don't know about his cues. They're very underrated. Um, when I first started buying and selling and trading those custom cues online, what I noticed is I would get a cue in the mail and the condition wouldn't be what the seller said it was. It would be in poor condition, dented, it needed new tips and all this, right? Now, at the time, I played pool every day after school, right? 3 o'clock, 3:30, I'd walk to school with my cues, put them in my locker, and then after school, I'd take them out and go to the pool.
Yep.
I'd be at the pool till 2 in the morning. I'd go eat breakfast with the waitresses at 3 a.m. and I'd go home and wake up at 7 and do it all over again. Now, the owner of my pool room in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, his name is Jeremy West. He used to do the cue repair. Now, he didn't specialize in cue repair. He just did it as a favor to the customers and fulfill a need. He didn't really make any money off it. And anyway, normally he used to put a tip on and it would take about a week. Now, for most people, because he was a busy guy, for most people, waiting a week for a tip was no big deal. You know, they play pool league every Wednesday. They drop it off Wednesday. They pick it up next Wednesday and play with it. Well, when I played pool 12 hours a day, every day after school, a week was a long time to go without my cue. And then one year I went to a state tournament, and Shane Walker from Jacoby Cues was set up there. He was doing cue repair on site. Now, he put a tip on for me, and he did it in about 5 minutes. And I said, "This only takes 5 minutes?" And he says, "Yeah." I said, "Wow." I said, "You know, I've been waiting a week." I said, "How long do I have to wait till I play with it? You know, does the glue have to dry?" Or he said, "No, it's ready." Now Jeremy didn't do bad work, but he was just a busy guy, and it took him longer to do things. So I said, "Man, I can't. Now that I know this only takes 5-10 minutes, I can't go a week without my cue anymore." So I started doing it by hand, watching YouTube videos, Googling stuff, and one thing led to another. And when I started buying and trading these cues, I got a lot of practice doing cue repair. I'd clean the shafts, I'd put new tips on, and you know, I started making more money off the cues I was buying and selling because I was getting a higher dollar fixed up.
Reconditioning them.
Yeah, I was getting them in poor condition, fixing them up myself, and then selling them for more. And I started doing all that by hand, you know, just tips and sanding shafts. And then my next step from there, when I really started getting into cue repair, is I said I would roll the shafts on my knee like a lathe, right? I would take it, roll it on my knee. Then the next step from there was a drill I bought from like a pawn shop. I'd plug the drill in, you know, take an old joint pin, chuck it up in the drill, use it with my feet on the floor and sand the shafts, and use the razor blade on the tip with the drill. And then, you know, then I knew I needed a lathe to do anything from there. So when I was 16, I bought a $800 Harbor Freight mini lathe, and I had a bed extension built long enough to do cue work. And I worked on that for probably about 6 months, and that was where I built my first cue. You know, it was more cue conversion, and I did a few of those, and I did some full refinishes, wraps. And of course, my work back then was very experimental, and it wasn't very good quality. But of course, over the years, you learn trial and error. And then when I was 16, I guess I would say I built my very first full cue from scratch. I had I started gambling a lot more playing pool when I was about that age. And I had a really good 2 weeks. And I beat a few guys out of a total of about 10,000. I beat a couple guys in Wisconsin, one named Dan Ramstack, Sean Sandrowski, and a few other people, all in about a 2-week period. And I had about 10,000. Now, all I did at the time was go to the pool hall and play pool after school. I wasn't concerned about getting a license or anything else that, you know, most kids that age are concerned about. So I knew I wanted a lathe, and I wanted to start doing better work and more cues, because I was just having fun with it at the time. And me being such a player at the time, it benefited me. I was saving money by doing my own cue repair. And you know, working on cues, you develop a weird relationship with the cue. You kind of become one with the cue. And you treat the cue a certain way, and it treats you a certain way when you play. So anyway, I took that 10,000 and I bought a Chris Hightower lathe and a bunch of wood and all kinds of stuff. And I built about 24 cues on that. And then that was my first step
Who bought
being a
your
real
first
cue maker. So the first cue I made really was a pretty good cue. A lot of cue makers, great cue makers like Mike Durbin, who you guys already interviewed, Dave Jacoby, who I actually used to work for and talked to. He just recently passed. And all sorts of great cue makers started from total scratch on their own with no information. So their cues were, their wives used them as fire pokers. They're just branches off a tree. Mine, you know, feel like I'm a pretty intelligent person, and I have the use of a lot of tools like the internet and books and videos. So before I got a lathe and everything, I already kind of knew how to do everything. I just never actually did it. So my first cue was actually a lot better than most cue makers. But I do remember who I sold it to, and I'll tell you a funny story. My first cue, I went to go post a picture of it online, and I was so excited the minute I finished and took it off the lathe, I wanted to take a picture of it. Well, I didn't have a pool table in my house. Mostly me, I'd take pictures of cues on pool tables or whatever. It's a nice, easy background, good lighting. Well, what I did is the only thing I could think of is I held the cue, and I still have the picture, but I held the cue in the mirror in the bathroom, and so my first picture, my first cue also happened to be my first bathroom selfie, my mirror selfie, right? And I got a lot of chuckles out of that, and it was fun. But a guy in Wisconsin who I used to play, and actually I think I beat him out of maybe $600 or $800 towards that 10,000 and he happened to buy the cue too, but his name was Eric Durant. He's from Wisconsin. He still has the cue. Now, at one point, I tried to buy that cue back, and some of my older cues just as, mementos, and for chuckles and see how far I came, and just kind of cool. And he wouldn't sell it back to me, which
that is a question
is
we have
okay.
written down for you.
Yeah.
Have you ever bought one of your cues back?
Yeah, I've bought a few of my early cues back. One just recently in New Orleans, Louisiana. One in Minnesota. I had one I bought from Wisconsin several times, and I plan on keeping them, but it's a funny thing. My whole life revolves around pool cues, and since I was young, when I first started buying and selling and trading cues, I mean, there was a point when I was back then, I had about 10 cues coming in the mail every day, and I was shipping about 10 cues out.
Wow.
And a lot of it was repairs, and some of it was trades, new cues I was buying and selling. And I mean, I was 16, getting and selling 10 cues a day, and those cues that I got, I'd play with them. I wanted to play with every one of them to see how they played, see which brand I liked. And people would always say, Austin, you should really stick with one cue. You'd play better. You'd be used to it. Why don't you play with one cue? Have your favorite cue made and just stick with that. Well, the problem is I like all the cues. I like every cue, so I can't just play with one cue or own one cue. So I get these cues and I get them, sell them, play with them. And, I've just never been able to keep a cue. My whole life revolves around these cues, but I can't keep any of them. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Oh, let's ask him how many cues he has right now.
Yeah, so I really would not say I've owned a cue in the last 5 years for more than a few weeks, maybe. Other than the exception, Jim Pierce, if you heard of Jim Pierce, the cue maker?
Uh-huh.
So he sponsored me about 6, 8 months ago, back in January, and I've had his cue for a while, and he just sent me a message out of the blue. He's seen me playing in Las Vegas with a bar cue, and I was playing like $1,000 match with a bar cue, and he's like, man, this is crazy, and I didn't even, at the time, this was the first time I met him, and he just sent me a message and said, man, you're a cue maker, you got to have a cue, do you like my cues? And he made me a cue, and I've had that since about January, so, but other than that, I haven't had a cue in about 5 years. I just buy them, sell them, fix them, trade them.
Do you build custom cues for people?
Yeah, so I started taking custom orders and stuff, but I'm kind of done doing that now. It's really hard to meet obligations all the time, especially when you're starting out and you have a smaller shop and less equipment. It takes a lot longer to do certain things than it does for guys like Mike Durbin, who's been an established cue maker for 35 years. He's got all his machines set up. He's got, he's a great example of a guy that gets things done fast, on time, well. And it's really hard to be able to do that. And I'm not in a position I'm able to do that yet. So I'm done taking custom orders.
Okay.
Most of the cues I've ever built were just things that I wanted to experiment with, or things I thought would be cool, or things I wanted to learn how to do that I just put together. That's most of the cues I built.
It's more like he's making art and then selling.
Yeah.
Okay, prettiest cue you ever made, in your opinion?
I can't really remember. So most of the cues that I've made myself on my own time really haven't been that fancy. But also, one of the reasons for that is that I've worked with a lot of other cue makers and been to a lot of other cue makers' shop. So a lot of my time I've spent in other guys' shops and not working in my own. Now, one of the reasons for that is research and development, right? So I've been young for years, and I plan on making some of the best cues in the world, later in life. But right now, I really am trying to learn from some of the best, and that's part of the reason I went to the Q show. And I visited that's one thing that sets me apart from a lot of cue makers and pool players is not only have I traveled playing pool, but in my spare time, any city I was at, no matter where I was, what time it was, I tried to go out of my way to visit the nearest cue maker. And one, that's just to meet them and tell stories and talk to them and say I got to know them. But that's also to see their shop and maybe learn something and share techniques and new ideas and learn. So I guess I'll continue my little biography from where I left off. When I was about 18, I graduated high school. And from there, I moved from Wisconsin, I moved to Minnesota to work with a cue maker by the name of Dale Chilton. Have you ever heard of him? So Dale Chilton was from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he used to make a lot of jump break cues and jump cues called these Flying Eagle jump cues. They were 2-shafted jump cues. He worked with a lot of diamond wood. You've seen like the diamond wood jump break cue and stuff. So I worked with him for about a year, and I apprenticed under him, and I learned a lot from him. So after I worked with him for about a year, I moved back to Wisconsin. And then I started working at Jacoby Cues. And I've learned so much from Jacoby, the company in general, but also Brandon, the owner, Dave, who just recently passed, Shane Walker, who is one of the head cue makers there, Tim Kobza, who's a master machinist there, Kenny, who's the number one repair guy, and just all the guys at Jacoby I've learned so much from. So I worked with them for a while. And then I traveled for about 3 years between there, and then I ended up in Las Vegas. So when I moved to Las Vegas, I worked for Southwest Cues, who everybody's heard of, right? Mm-hmm. So I worked there for a short period, learned a lot of old school techniques, different methods, and I've been to over 3 dozen cue maker shops in between, anywhere from the most prestigious cue makers in the world, like Pete Tonkin, Dennis Searing, Joel Hersek, Joey Gold, Cognizant Cues. I've never been to Jerry McWhirter's shop. Hopefully, he'll let me in someday. But all the way around to small guys that people have never heard of, or that are just up and coming good cue makers, like Cody Cash from Wichita, Kansas. Tiger Products, they're big, stacked leather wraps, tips, break cues, jump cues. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I've been to, P Shower and Viking and McDermott and all the production companies. And, I've had a lot of experience in meeting the people that work there, but I've also learned a lot. And a lot of cue makers don't know too much about what other cue makers do or how they build their cues. People only know what works for them. The benefit about me over other cue makers is that I know a lot about everybody. So I'm kind of like in the Secret Service of cue making.
Pool cue detective.
Yeah, pool cue detective. That's a good, yeah.
Chris, what kind of questions we got?
So what materials do you prefer to work with?
So I did watch your guys' interview with Mike Durbin, and I like that you guys asked him that question. And part of the reason I like that you asked him is because he's a very good player. I'm a decent player. I'm not a great player. Mike is a lot better player than me, and Jerry is too, actually. But I think you'll find that a lot of cue makers will have a very similar answer to that question. The guys that play good, not only the guys that play good, but the guys that do a lot of build cues for the good players. In my opinion, as a player and a cue maker, I think you'll get a lot of answers similar to Durbin's. A lot of guys that play good and build good cues that play good, they like stiff and dense woods in the form. So a forward balanced cue and stiff forms like ebony and cocobolo, similar to what Mike Bender said. Almost every top cue maker, their number one material to work with inside of that cue is ivory. or ivory substitutes like Alforan and Juma and things like that, Super Tusk. Stiff cues really tend to be what stiff forward balanced cues really what good players tend to like. I think that's what made Southwest so popular. And that's something that Ernie Gutierrez, who invented Gina Q, that's what he discovered way back in the 60s and 70s. That he said he was one of the first people to ever make an ebony forearm cue. And there's a Justin Collett who ran TAR.
TAR, yeah.
He has a 2-hour shop tour and interview with Ernie on YouTube.
I watched that.
And I've seen it 15 times since I was 10 years old. You know what I mean? I've watched it a million times. And one of the things Ernie talked about that when he very first started making ebony forearm cues, he said that it bred a whole new level of player. And it was a cue that nobody's ever seen before. And it did things with the ball that nobody else could do. It being more forward weighted and stiffer in the center really gives the cue ball a lot of power and penetration. You can draw your cue ball farther. The cue gets through the ball better. Definitely more dense, harder woods like that
All right.
is what I prefer.
I got a follow-up question to that.
Oh, before you say that, let me say this other thing. The other thing about playability is people always argue about playability when it comes to cues. And the typical thing people say is, like I said, it's the Indian, not the arrow. That's true to a certain extent. Of course, you can't play world-class pool with a broomstick. You have to have a decent mid-level, maybe just say a $500 cue, But one thing a lot of people don't realize is that having the right cue, it will not make you a better player, but the right cue will let you play as good as you can. So somebody like me, I'll give you an example. Somebody like me who has, I have weaker fundamentals, I have kind of a shorter, punchier stroke. I have a hard time following through. My arms are longer than my cue, typically, like my arm span puts me on the back of the cue and I bridge farther from the ball. So for the right cue for me seems to be a longer cue, maybe 61, 62 inches, very forward bounced, stiffer, especially because it's so long, a little bit lower deflection, but not too low. So now, a $5,000 cue, it's a great cue, but it doesn't mean it's going to be a great cue for me. But the right cue with the right specs lets me and will allow me to play my best. It won't make me a better player, but it will allow me to play my best. And that's what a lot of people don't realize. And that's part of the reason I got into cue repair too and modifying cues. I would buy and sell all these cues, and even though they're great cues, I couldn't play with them for some reason, or I didn't like them, and I wanted to make changes. I cut the shafts shorter, changed the ferrule material, added weight, put a whole different pin in the cue, different tips, of course. I've put 6 different tips on in 6 days, before. So, I just wanted to get that point across that a $5,000 cue will not make you a better player, but the right cue will allow you to play your best. That's a very common misconception thing that I wanted to get through.
Well, you just answered my question.
Oh, okay.
I was going to ask, can a cue actually make you play better?
Yeah. So the answer is it can let you play better, but it will not make you play better.
All right, Chris.
But if it's comfortable, it can give you more confidence.
That is very true.
Wrap or no wrap for you?
I'm assuming you're talking about playing.
For your cue.
Yeah, playing. There's another misconception as far as cue making. A lot of people think that wrapped cues are cheaper, and that a wrap is just a way to cover up a cheap and inaccurate or lower quality piece of wood under the wrap. Instead of using a nice piece of figured burl or putting inlays there, they think it's cheaper. I would argue that most of the time, building a wrapped cue is longer and takes more work and actually costs more to build than a wrapless cue. Even though the piece of wood, the material cost might be higher, the labor and the work that goes into the cue is so much greater with a wrap that wrapless cues, in my opinion, generally cost more. But as far as playing with one, I went through different periods of time in my life where I really like linen. I really like leather. I played with wrapless. For some reason, the last few years I've been playing, maybe it's because I've been gambling or different environments, whatever. But my hands have been starting to sweat when I play a little bit. And with a wrapless cue, it gets kind of slippery, and you got to wipe it down. And so I would say a wrapped cue, and I would probably generally say leather. It just depends.
My next wrap's going to be made out of cork. I know.
Yeah, cork. Yeah.
I'm going to have a cork wrap for the first time.
Cork wraps are very cool. I liked them since I was a kid. There's different kinds. The only downside to cork wraps, they're not as durable. You get dented, chunks come out. It's soft. It's a very soft material most of the time. And it also gets dirty, and if your hands sweat, it'll absorb anything on your hands. So you kind of get, you gotta maintain them. They get kind of dirty and smelly, and especially like if somebody smokes, you can smell it on the cork wrap, just like you could a linen wrap, same type of thing. But they're very cool. There's only a handful of guys in the country that do cork wraps, and good ones at that. And it's also just like you've heard of the stacked leather wraps. So I kind of consider myself a wrap specialist.
You were doing more wraps than anybody for a long time.
Yeah, and I've done it well. And what most people see is the stack wrap, because it's very flashy, like product wraps. And a lot of cue makers won't do the stack wraps because they're very labor intensive. They take a long time. They're very messy, and a lot of people just don't want to deal with them. But the wraps is one of the most overlooked things in a cue. It's one of the hardest things to do. So, and if you put a poor wrap on, it's the first thing everybody sees and feels on your cue.
So all you guys with your Predator Brave wraps wearing out, it's time to get a stacked leather wrap on there.
And I don't know how much time. I don't know how much time we have, but there is one thing I would like to get to concerning the Predator. I don't know how much time do we have left.
20.
Okay. Well, let me just jump into it, because to be honest with you, that's one of the main reasons I want to do this interview. Chris, have you been seeing some of the Predator memes and the discussions on Facebook over Predator lately?
Over the painted, whether it's painted or not painted, or
Yeah, so I wanted to voice my opinion on that. One, because I feel I have a little more valid opinion than the average pool player when it comes to cues and things like that. And I don't work for Predator, and I've owned a lot of Predator cues, and there's things I like, things that I don't like, all kinds of things. But in the cue world, there's a lot of rumors and false opinions and things like that, especially over very successful cue makers and cue companies such as Southwest. When I worked there, there's all kinds of rumors. And there's Dennis Searing, whose cues sell for incredible amounts of money and are very hard to get. It's just like any other aspect of life. Somebody who's very successful at something has a lot of haters. And Predator has a lot of haters. And some of it is credible, but they need to get credit where credit is due. That's no matter who you are. Nobody's perfect. But one of the things I wanted to mention about Predator is people are talking about these painted cues. Okay, now I will say one thing, Predator does not lie about what their cues are. A lot of misinformed, un-cue educated pool players, form their own opinions in their mind that causes them to believe a certain thing, but Predator doesn't actually say it. You see what I'm saying? So, for example, people are talking about these midnight maple, or Jacoby calls it ebonized maple, or, where they're either the wood, they just use maple. Now, it's just the maple that goes in any other cue. It's good quality, hard rock, Canadian or Michigan maple. And it's either painted black or stained black or dyed. And one of the things I wanted to say is that just because a cue is painted or stained or dyed black does not make it a bad cue. Just because a cue is inlaid or overlaid, which is essentially stickers that go under the clear coat, that doesn't make it a bad cue. Now, that might make the cue overpriced, in your opinion. If that makes it cheaper to make, but that doesn't mean it's a bad cue. A lot of Predator also gets a bad name because a lot of their stuff is made overseas. Okay, well, at the same time, a lot of it is made here in the States. A lot of it is made by them in Jacksonville, Florida, and in Boston, Massachusetts at their factories. A lot of it is made by companies like Jacoby and Peace Shower and other custom cue makers that have done work for them and have contracts. these painted cues and some of these overlaid cues, and a lot of predators are inlaid too. It's not, there's a lot of misconception behind it. Don't take what I'm saying literally, but these painted and overlaid cues are still good cues. The fit and finish is good quality. The wraps are installed, generally speaking, very well. The cues hit and play good for most people. Not everybody's going to like everything. That's why there's so many different cue makers. Like, people play with different things. Generally speaking, all around, Predator builds a very good cue. And I just want the public to realize that there's cues out there that are real ebony, that aren't painted, that are real inlays, that are inlaid with gold and silver, that are thousands and thousands of dollars, that are not as good of cues as the lowest end painted and stickered Predator. All these companies and cue brands do different things better than others. And the truth is, especially to the average pool player, like your league player or whatever, they could have a poor quality pool cue, but if it is clear coated well, if the wrap is put on well, if they put their carbon fiber shaft on there, you could tell them that's a $10,000 cue, even though it's $300, and they're not going to know the difference. Because what they see, the clear coat and the wrap, and the way they put the shaft they put on there, because what they see and feel is good, they think it's good, even though it's a poor quality cue. On the other hand, there's a lot of custom guys that build very good cues. I mean, they're some of the best cue builders in the world, but they do a poor job clear coating the cue. They might not do as good of a job wrapping the cue. Their joint faces might not be clean. Even though they build great cues, their tips might not be put on perfect for everybody to play with properly. And even though they're one of the best cue builders in the world, some of them, they're not as good at cues. Most people, it could be the best cue in the world, but most people, if they don't know who made it, they won't think it's a good cue, because what they see and feel is not done as well as a Predator, for instance. So I just wanted to say a few things about that, and I didn't, people give Predator more hate than they deserve, and I'm sticking up for Predator a little bit, unassociatively,
Okay.
So that's what I wanted to say about that.
and they're doing a lot for the sport. They're doing a lot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's the main thing is how much they are doing for the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my moral to wrap that up would be that I would say you could say the Predators are overpriced, but they're not bad cues, And a lot of these cues being made overseas now, what a lot of people don't understand is they're better cues than almost all the cues being produced in the United States, whether that's high production or custom cues, like North Demon Cues, who's out of North China. I'm sure a lot of people have seen those. Zen cues. Kung Fu Panda has a really nice Zen cue. Kung Fu Panda is a local player. Tony Chow is his name, right? He's an Oklahoma. I'll give him a shout out. He's got a very nice, $6,000 or $7,000 Zen cue that's made overseas. Some of these back in the day, historically for years, it's cheap garbage. It's made overseas. Well, the truth is, some of these Japanese cue makers, Exceed and Mez, and all these other companies, they're building better, even though they're made overseas, they're better cues than we're making here in the States now. A lot of people, so people need to just do a little bit more research when it comes to cues. And I hate to see people bash cue makers and the quality of cues when their opinion is not supported and their opinion's not educated or researched into. So
and your average pool player is not going to know the difference between a $300 cue and a $3,000 cue anyway.
No, they're not.
So.
Nope.
All right, Chris, let's do a couple more questions and wrap this up. I do want to do another interview with Austin Hill once he's on the road a little bit. Man, I've been seeing you every day for a week.
Yeah.
And
have you met Chad McClendon yet?
Yes, I met him at the ICCS show.
So
that was one of the coolest parts about the show as well. Chad was only stay there for a few hours. I know he's a cue maker, but a lot of people don't understand. He's also has a full-time 60-hour-a-week job, I believe, on an Air Force base. And he's a real cool guy. But I've known Chad for years, and I've talked to him for 5 or 6 or more years on Facebook. And that the same goes for guys like Pete Tonkin and other cue makers that I've known for years. Bill Lister is a guy, sells cues in Florida, builds custom cues now. Super good guy. I worked with him for a short period of time too. But a lot of these guys I've known since I was 14, 15, 16 years old, and I formed relationships via Facebook Messenger and buying and selling cues. But I've never got to meet them for the first time until like this Q show, for instance. So this Q show was the first time I ever met Chad in person. But, you know, we know who each other are. We talk to each other. We have mutual understandings about cues. You know, it's just crazy some of the people you meet through cues and how, you know, the friendships you form. Like I just recently, just a year ago, I met a guy named John Showman. Okay. He's one of the most, I'm going to say, elusive cue makers there is. His cues are extremely rare, and he makes very simple, traditional style cues, diamonds, dots, 4 points, and they sell for very high amounts of money compared to most cues. And, you know, he's a guy that I've heard his name for years and seen some of his cues. I've only seen maybe half a dozen of his cues for sale in my whole life.
Wow.
And, you know, I got to meet him a year ago, and I'm not kidding you. Ever since I met him, I've talked to him on the phone or via call or text every single day, multiple times a day for the last year. And he's a guy who's one of those idols for me, who's a celebrity that I never thought in a million years I'd get to see one of his cues, own one of his cues, or even know him. And now I talk to him on the phone every day for a year. You know, I stayed at his house. I visited his shop. I know his wife and kids. You know, it's just kind of cool. So
I got a question regarding that. So you've gotten to talk to a lot of these people, especially online, but just now getting to meet some of them. Who's next? Who do you want to meet that you've only talked to or spoke with? And you want to go see them? Or
yeah, there's a lot of guys' shops that I want to visit yet. You know, such as Jerry's and a few other guys. I've seen a lot, so there's some. I'd like to see them all, just because you never know what you're going to see. It's always a surprise what you might see or what you might learn or hear. But really, my number one, if I had to pick one, or my bucket list shop next, is Gina Q, Ernie Gutierrez. He's in Hollywood.
Okay.
He's the godfather of cue making. He's the greatest cue maker of all time. He's been the most successful cue maker. He's made more money than any cue maker. He's the hardest working, best businessman cue maker there could ever be. He's the godfather. He was one of the first guys to start making custom cases to match his cues. A lot of people don't know he kind of invented the Fellini style case.
Okay.
He was one of the first guys to make an ebony formed cue. First guy, he pretty much invented matching joint protectors.
Yeah.
You know, he was just the first one to do so many things, and he's just all around the greatest cue maker of all time. Has one of the nicest shops, built all his own equipment. He's my bucket list cue maker to meet and visit his shop and maybe get a tattoo of his logo. You know.
Well, if we interview him,
Someday.
will you be on the interview with us?
Yeah, you know, I would. Probably not. A guy like him, you want to let him talk and you want to listen. You know, any more people than what you need would just get in the way, I think.
Okay.
So, yeah, he's my bucket list for sure. And the other thing I wanted to say too, just because I get a lot of questions because I travel so much. I've been to so many shops and cities and pool halls, and a really frequently asked question two of them. I'll just ask myself 2 questions for you guys, quick. People say, "What's your favorite pool hall?" You know, or "What's the nicest pool hall you've been to?" I've been to a lot of nice pool halls, and I've been to a lot of not so nice pool halls. And the truth is, you know, I've lived in Vegas for a long time, so everybody say, "Oh, you know, Griff's, that's the best pool hall in the world." Well, the truth is, some people feel that way, and I see why. That it's very clean, it's big, they got good tables, good food. There's nothing bad to say about the place, but a place like where we're at, Chester's, these are the types of pool halls that I like. Kind of dive bar style, kind of dirtier, dingy, been around for years. They have history. They have characters that come around. The building has stories of itself. There's a whole nother atmosphere. Chester's here, that John Barton now owns, Knoxville Billiards, who's owned by Billy Gray in Knoxville, Tennessee. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's pool halls like that those are my favorite pool halls. And it's a lot of it's the people you meet there, you know, and the stories that get formed. And So those are just two examples of my favorite pool halls. And then the other thing is a common question I get asked is, who are the best cue makers? Because people are always, and it's all debatable. It's all opinion. It's subjective. But I do want to list like just, top 5 or 10 guys, just so people can relate to who, at this point I would say my opinion is pretty educated. And so there's a lot of people that bring people up that really aren't. They might make great cues, but they're not the best cue makers. So in no particular order, I want to list who I think are some of the best, who I know, and every other cue maker who the guys that know the most about cues, who they all think are the best cue makers. Okay. In no particular order.
All right.
I could never. But Ernie Gutierrez at Gina Q, he's probably the only one. I don't think anybody's going to debate. He's number one in all categories, all around. But also Pete Tonkin out of Willow Creek, California. Dennis Searing, he's in Florida. Dennis Searing thinks, and I agree with him, he thinks John Showman is pound for pound the best cue maker on earth, considering the style of cues he builds and the equipment he builds them on. Also, Lori and Jerry Franklin at Southwest Cues. They don't build the best, craziest, fancy cues in the world, but for the types of cues that they build, they do a phenomenal job in the same manner that they've been being built for 30 years or more. That's 4. Okay. Jerry McWhorter's in the top 10 for sure.
Okay.
But that was that 5.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Manzino. Okay. He's in Florida too. He's built some of the nicest, classiest, innovative cues. Thomas Wayne, who is no longer making cues, I believe. He's from Alaska. But these are all guys that have made and sold cues for anywhere between $200 when they first started out to $20, $30, $40, $50, and $100,000 cues that they've made that have won awards and things. There's a lot of, good cue makers, but those are some of the greatest.
Those are pretty good names there.
Yeah, then there's other guys I missed too, but there's a lot of them.
So with all the pool halls that you've been to, so part of this show is to visit these older pool halls. And I know Griff's, we've done one on Chester's, we've done one on Lucky's. I've done one on the pool hall in Boise, Idaho. We've done one on Slim's in Amarillo. So what are some of the pool halls? Let's say 3 pool halls that we should visit to do a story on.
Yeah, there's definitely some milestone for sure visit pool halls. And sadly, a lot of them have closed in the last few years. I would definitely say right now, one of the biggest, most popular, crazy, old school type pool halls around. And I'm not going to say it's it's like the cue maker list. I can't list them in meaningful order.
Right.
But I would say Buffalo's Billiards it's in Metairie, Louisiana, which is just outside New Orleans. That's a must visit pool hall. I mean, it's and the owner is like no other. James Leone, look him up on Facebook. He has some of the funniest posts, and he posts every day about just day-to-day life in his pool hall and with the employees, his businesses, the pool players, the action. And a lot of it's good, and a lot of it's not so good stuff, but it's all entertaining and hilarious.
It'd be a reality show.
Yeah, that's a must-visit pool hall for sure. And then there's other ones too. Boy, I don't know, but Buffalo's is probably at the top of the list, really.
Well, no,
I
know I want to visit Hot Pockets. I've never
been. Yeah, High Pockets in Memphis. Yeah, the owner Tracy Whitney. He's a good guy, and that's kind of an older school kind of. And there's actually a few there's a documentary or a news clip of St. Louis Roberts, who's the house pro at High Pockets, and that gives you a really cool look at High Pockets. But yeah, I really like the places like that have remained mostly unchanged over the last 20, 30 years, where the building and the memorabilia and the stories and the characters that are in there date back to some of the highest points in pool, like, the 80s when the Color Money came out and when pool was at one of its greatest all-time peaks. And for me, too, that time is also one of the highest points in cue making. A lot of people don't understand cue making as an art form. The 2-piece pool cue has only been around for 70, 80 years. Now, compared to every other art form, that's not very long. They've been around for thousands of years.
Mhm.
You know, the first fancy two-piece custom cues were really started, you know, in the 50s, 60s, you know, by guys like Harvey Martin and Herman Rambo and, you know, companies like Palmer and Gus Sambodi and George Bell. But that's really when cues first started turning into what they are today. So, you know, for me, any buildings or pool halls or places or people that date back to those eras, I really like, you know,
Club Billiards, Wichita,
yeah,
Kansas.
yeah. And that place is, I spent a lot of time there about 5 years ago. I used to live in Wichita for 6 months to a year, and I really enjoyed that place too. It's been through a few owners and stuff. It's changed, and I haven't been there since. I've just seen online, but yeah, that's one too, for sure. Um, you know,
Chris, what do you got on that list? I know we got it.
do you have another question or anything before? I can sit and talk about cues and stuff all day. That's all I do. So I don't, you know, but I know you guys have some other interviews to do today and calls.
Well, I mean, he just about covered anything, you know, everything that you've put on here without even having to ask him. So how many cues do you make a year?
Like I said earlier, because of me traveling so much, and then also working for other cue makers, and also I've also given a lot of cue making lessons. A lot of people don't really know about that. You know, I have a lot of good friends and people that I've met online that, you know, I've stopped and stayed with them for a couple weeks to either, you know, help them because they needed work to get done, or I needed some money, you know, to further my adventures on learning how to build cues and play pool and just live. So I've given a lot of cue making lessons and stuff too. So every year is different, but there's been years where I've made quite a few cues. But I would say, you know, and I lived in Las Vegas for the last 4 years, and for the last 2 years is when I really got going pretty good. But I built about 250 cues in 2 years with one lathe by myself. Now a lot of that's including, you know, jump cues and break cues and, you know, simpler stuff. But that's a lot for a first year, you know, one car garage, one lathe, one person starting fresh. So, but I can attribute all that to, you know, my experiences like working at Jacoby and Southwest and helping guys like Bill Lister and visiting John Showman and Dennis Arian and being at Rick Howard, who makes Mace cues, or, you know, Rick Howard cues. And there's just so many guys that I've been to and learned from. And, you know, I've become pretty fast, efficient, educated, and eventually, you know, someday when I put it all together and become the cue maker I want to be and have the shop I want, yeah, I have no doubt in my mind I'll be extremely successful.
Have you visited Prather's shop yet?
No, I've not, which is pretty strange. I bought a lot of things from them. I've seen a lot of their cues. I have not been to their shop yet. I would like to someday.
He's just a real nice guy.
Yeah, there's a lot of cue makers and stuff in Oklahoma. To be honest, I haven't spent too much time in Oklahoma. I've been here a few times for maybe a week or so at a time. There's just I've just always been more out towards the coast. I spent a lot of time in the dirty South, the West Coast, and then you know, out towards the Carolinas and the Midwest where I'm from, obviously, you know, Wisconsin and Illinois and Iowa. And, I don't know, Oklahoma. I just recently visited a cue maker in Texas, Kevin McLean, who makes Gold Rush cues. Super nice guy. He builds really great cues, builds a lot better cues than the average cue you'll see on Facebook.
I'd say that he's the most traveled cue maker in America right now.
Maybe at my age that might be true.
You just like live on the road, go one way.
Yeah,
everywhere.
pretty much. Yeah, I haven't been home in 8 or 9 months now at this point. You know, and I, like I said, I go from tournament to cue maker shop to another tournament to, you know, do whatever I can learn from. You know, I'm young, so I might as well travel what I can and learn what I can, and then before I get too old and can't go anywhere and got to use it.
Or tied down.
Yeah, or tied. Yeah. Well, I'm tied down to pool cues at the moment, so you know.
All right, Chris, let's wrap it up.
All right, yeah, that's all I got for now. Austin, we appreciate you joining us. Guys, if y'all like content like this, please hit that subscribe button right down there and hit the like, share, and hit the notification bell. That way, you know every time that we upload new content. We'll talk to y'all later.
Thanks.
All right. Appreciate it.